I'll,
Yeah, sounds good.
okay, so we're here to talk a little bit about compliance at GitLab in between release and the compliance stage. So Matt, would love to hear a little bit more about how compliance is going today and where you'd want to take it in the next couple of years so that I know where I can hook in as a partner in our product world.
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much for scheduling the call. So I have a call scheduled with Jeremy to talk about this exact thing. So this will be a good practice, I think. Let me share my screen real quick because I created this mural, which I hope will demonstrate what we need. Bear with me. There we go. So the way that I currently think about it is this idea that organizations are operating in industries that are regulated in some way. That could be regulated from a legal perspective, things like Sarbanes-Oxley. That could be regulated from I guess, an industry best practices perspective, like SOC 2. GDPR is another legal or regulatory one. And so these would fall under what I would consider compliance frameworks. So there are these frameworks that say, if you're going to operate in this industry, or if you're going to operate in some way that we're concerned with, you have to meet certain rules and requirements, or certain requirements, I should say.
We should consider adding GLBA as we decide to penetrate more into financial services as well.
Yeah, for sure. This is not exhaustive. And
Totally.
I think part of the hierarchy, the hierarchy theme here is that frameworks are all basically the same, kind of in their fundamental premise, in that we're concerned with security, with data privacy, with access control, with separation of duties. These are all just common themes. And so from the compliance frameworks perspective, I'm an advocate of using the work our internal security compliance team has done under the GitLab control framework. They've essentially mapped this control family framework to existing frameworks like SOC 2, SOX, and ISO, I think, are the current ones. So if we can go about evolving that to add GLBA, GDPR, HIPAA, NIST, COVID, all of these different frameworks that already exist, I think it makes it a much more seamless process, not just for us to maintain it, but it also gives us this thought leadership perspective. It allows us to associate our name of GitLab with compliant, secure, stress-free management of compliance programs. So frameworks is that overarching concept. Within that, I see three main categories: compliance controls, which is, okay, I know the requirements of the framework, but they vary as far as how prescriptive they are. Some are very prescriptive, like PCI DSS or Sarbanes-Oxley. Some are much less prescriptive, like SOC 2. They just say you have to have a process in place for managing passwords, but they don't say what that is necessarily. And so the compliance controls aspect is the features that we can build to facilitate, not necessarily guarantee compliance, because I think that's a liability that we can't or shouldn't take on, but we can certainly enable compliance to some degree. And so those are things like merge request approvals, scanning policies, allowing customers to hook in their external services as part of deployments, and then capturing the approvals as part of that. So those types of controls. Audit events is another. Oh, go ahead.
That first one is very relevant to something that I'm starting to scratch the surface on in release governance. So a couple of FinServe customers are very interested in the manual interventions that one has to take in order to get code to production. And when I start to dig into the reasons why, they're not always surfacing that I need this to be compliant. Sometimes it's, I want to have a chain of custody. I want to understand what my organization is doing. I want to have a say as a manager. So this is where I'm starting to notice this bifurcation of the user persona versus the buyer personas. And a lot of these governance and approval actions are more toward a buyer persona. And I was wondering if you're seeing that same sort of fit, or if compliance is really speaking to the sysadmin persona very strongly.
So, yeah, I think on that note, so two things. One, I think that compliance, right, is ultimately under the umbrella of governance, risk, and compliance. And so it's all about mitigating risk in this particular context, how we're talking about legal and regulatory frameworks, it's about reducing risk and liability of data breaches and the associated fines that come with it. To your second point about buyer versus user persona, what I've noticed in my conversations, and I think speaks to your point, is the users of GitLab. Some of them have dubbed themselves the GitLab custodians, but the day-to-day users of GitLab are tasked with the tactical piece of internal audit or compliance team says, hey, I need to see evidence that you're adhering to policy because I have this other objective over here. And so the day-to-day users are not necessarily compliance or audit themselves. In fact, some of them have said, I wish that my audit and compliance or security team can just come in a read-only way and just do what they need to do, set policy, enforce policy, collect evidence, but not see the code base, not take any right or execute action and that kind of thing. So there's also an issue I've created to work with UX research to define the compliance persona, because I think that's missing. And I think as we work through that process, we'll also put better clarity around the buyer versus user relationship in this context.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. And so the second main category is audit events. Basically every single enterprise customer I've spoken to that has compliance on the mind, whether that's legal, regulatory, or just internal good practice, I think like what you were alluding to, it's always been about, we need visibility that manifests as audit events. So if there are gaps in the activity, meaning if they go in to answer questions, which is factually the case as they've conveyed, if they go in to look for answers and they can't find them about who took what action when, for what purpose, that kind of information, then those are gaps. Those are auditable events that an external auditor will come in and say, for example, show me the last 6 months of merge requests for project A and B. If I, sorry, dogs, if I pull that information and they see, okay, well, I'm missing A, B, and C type of data in this audit log, then they'll then have a gap, and they'll have a gap identified, right? They then have to remediate that gap. Well, if that data is only available within GitLab, that falls to us. And so we then become an impediment to their auditability and their compliance with that independent third party. So audit events are critical for general visibility, but also auditability so that we're not the roadblock. And then the last one is just the reporting aspect. So it's great if we have this level of granularity in the audit events, but if customers are still having to do a lot of the heavy lifting, that's time and money that they're spending for something that's not necessarily value adding. It is in that it makes the audit process easier, so they be willing to invest that time and effort. But if we can make that a one-click option to say, you know, for the last 6 months, pull a report of all merge request activity, and then we provide in that report the detail that we find through research and validation is most satisfactory for auditors, then we've made their job a lot simpler. We've improved their quality of life. We've reduced the friction of audits in general. And so that's my general thinking at a high level and how I've sort of framed it visually.
So that's super, this whole thing is super helpful, by the way, thank you. And I'm taking now ideas on how to inject some of your language or thoughts into the released post items that I have that are related very strongly to compliance. For example, I have capture release events as a part of our audit logs. And a big part of that story is going to be both your audit event strengthening, but also reducing the friction of people successfully completing an audit. And how I phrased it was, now that GitLab can do these things for you, we also automatically support your audit journey. And it'd be good for us to align on how you want to frame the audit journey in GitLab and where other people in your stage, outside of your stage, can then take those words and inject it in their own stage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, thoughtful messaging of that whole premise, because I think it's ultimately about part of the friction in auditing or compliance in general is that it's seen as this this task that's a burden, right? Because if I'm a sysadmin, if I'm an engineer or something, I don't want to do things that are outside the scope of my responsibilities. I want to be able to do my job, and I want to do it well. And so if we're able to build in functionality that says, okay, do your job, we'll handle the burden of that thing that your internal compliance or auditing team is asking for, then yeah, I think that's perfect. I think compliance, or GRC, right? Governance, risk, and compliance, is such a broad concept. I think it'll likely touch every stage at GitLab out of necessity. But on the same, like on the different side of the same coin is like, we're not able to include in our scope some of the things like organizational operations and many parts of disaster recovery and configuration management, things like that, right? Some of those organizational things fall outside. And so that's kind of a nice thing because it allows us to focus on a very narrow set of control families that I think we can really excel at and become leaders on. But as far as connecting with folks outside of like my stage, my group, it's hard to pinpoint because I think it's a mindset. Like if you were an employee at just any company and remove yourself from kind of the PM perspective for a second, and you were, let's say, a manager of people, you have to be in the mindset that the actions you take have to comply with the policies that your company has set forward, knowing what the consequences or the challenges would be if your actions, behaviors, et cetera, are found to be non-compliant. And so similar, I think, to GitLab is that PMs have to have that mindset of, I'm building for, let's say, release. Well, I have to be in the mindset of like, if I'm deploying this feature, what is the customer going to be going through workflow wise, and what evidence artifacts might they need to generate from this feature that we can then coordinate with Matt over in managed compliance to say, okay, how do we then link up on this to where, either it becomes part of that feature if it makes sense, or it's a separate issue that gets created that I can then tackle, or whatever that looks like. But it's ultimately a mindset, and that's a really tough challenge, I think.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's a handbook page that we should build out as a part of our product development and validation workflow that involves, really understanding the compliance needs as a part of your new issue. So like in our opportunity canvas, if security first is something that GitLab is really going after, a big part of that is addressing the compliance needs in every single thing you do. And that part is missing in our templates for both like feature proposal or how you even look at that. I wonder if there's something prescriptive that we can give to our product managers to help them, one, come to you with a proposal rather than being like, hey, look at my proposal and tell me what you need to do to make this compliant. Is I think that's where this could get really messy for you from a compliance perspective, is that everyone comes to you and says, what do I need to do to make this compliance?
Right. Yeah. It's a multifold concern, right? Because I become a bottleneck in theory. It's because it's not scalable for me to have input on the dozens or hundreds of issues. I think it burdens the product development and release process to where we start sacrificing velocity for the sake of compliance considerations. So yeah, I mean, all that to say is I don't know the answer. I don't know if it's necessarily a process change or if it's a mindset change. I'm leaning towards it's a mindset change, because I think that in a perfect world, every feature we release would account for these, audit events, the evidence artifacts that have to be generated, et cetera. Because ultimately it has to be this unified experience. And I think you'll find that, if you look at auditors, like external auditors in auditing firms as an example, their whole world is just having this very critical thinking mindset as it pertains to a company's structure and operation. So an auditor walks in your door and they're immediately thinking about, okay, I didn't go through any sign-in process. I don't see any surveillance cameras. I was able to walk in escorted, but there is no security code. So I'm curious to know what their technology policies look like. And so having that same level of critical thinking, I think, but to the benefit of our customers of, okay, I want to build out this really cool feature under plan, but what is my customer going to need if they're a Fortune 500 company and they have all of these various risk mitigation and liability concerns because of the industry they're in? And that's just really hard because it's just really hard.
Yeah. And what I want to be able to do is almost have your stage be the best practices, like creates a bunch of best practices that we can, like services almost, that we can implement inside of something like release management or progressive delivery. So for example, audit events, almost every issue that I'm creating now, I look at it and be like, are we doing something that needs to be scribed back into an audit log? And then I put that as a part of the acceptance criteria. But for things that are a little bit bigger than that are related to compliance controls, I'm not savvy enough to know, would this benefit or touch a compliance control system that GitLab might be related to in some regulated industry. But I know that if I invest in that area, that'll help the adoption and that'll increase my SMAO in release if we can meet those regulated customers' needs. So it behooves me to increase my SMAO by relating all my issues to satisfy compliance requirements. So I'm wanting to understand, how can I best hook in, not slow you down, not slow down our development process, but still be thoughtful about it.
Yeah, and I think you touched on the biggest challenge, right? Is you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
There are a litany of things I don't know about various compliance frameworks and situations, and I've been immersed in that area for several years now. Maybe it's just inherently the circumstance that PMs release features. They do their best to give what attention they can or consideration they can to the compliance implications. But then maybe it's just how things have to be, at least for now, that I have a workflow to go and look at the features that are being released, listening to the customers telling me, hey, this, 5 of the features you released, I can't use them because there's no audit events, or I can't use them because it's lacking some sort of permission granularity control, or I can't use them because your whatever, your team and group structure doesn't work for me. And maybe it just has to be necessarily reactive. Which I don't think is necessarily bad in and of itself. I think at that point, though, we then have to make sure that we're moving quickly if we're reactive. But I think that might be, in my opinion right now, that might be the best path forward versus trying to front load our internal process with it, because it would be, I think, a huge cost to try and introduce it to the process when there is both an educational aspect of it, or to it, combined with the additional time required to figure out how that manifests in terms of features or supplemental features.
Okay, that's helpful. I think for release management specifically, we have a little bit more overlap specifically around things like deploying to production environments and those audit trails that need to be ingrained in our inherent process. But also, as we start to learn more about the vision and application of things like release governance, there's something to be said around using something like run books to do a manual approval action and to prevent a deployment. But there's also something like making sure that runbook action that we stopped a deployment because a runbook task wasn't complete is transcribed into an audit log, but also that an auditor can see that wasn't just a normal actor, that was a machine performing that act from an outside point of view. But looking at these compliance control systems, I wonder if this is an opportunity where I can just identify the ones that I'm seeing regulated industries have more interest in. And maybe that's where we can partner more specifically around.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great iterative step in our journey towards figuring out how this could work. I think part of the challenge, even in just knowing when it might be helpful to loop me in and collaborate on things, is listening for those keywords, phrases, or concerns, right? So to one of your earlier points about how the premise was not, or the root pain point was not necessarily an explicit, well, I need this for a compliance purpose or audit reason. It was, well, I just like governance and I need to know what's happening. Like those are key terms that I'd be willing to bet that they have something internal, external, some program that's guiding that style, that approach, right? So it's great if I'm wrong and they just want to know what's happening because they like that visibility to have that control and operate under best practice. But that's usually not the case, right? Because it's extra work. And so people are being driven by some requirement, and it's usually tied into some framework.
Or it could be that there's this inherent culture shift that's disrupting old school thought about needing to have that waterfall action to deploy to production versus companies who are really leveraging a CI/CD pipeline and who trust in their automation, who build out robust test suites. I mean, I think I was reading an article the other day that suggested everyone gets through CI, but the minute that they hit CD, they stop their process because adopting this let it release automatically to production without human intervention is something that's scary and fearful. So there's also this in the market where GitLab's competing and where we're going against all these other tools that people are more comfortable being involved in seeing the actions, or being able to intervene more thoughtfully, even if it isn't governed by an audit action. But I think 9 times out of 10, it is.
Yeah, and I'd love to understand that too, right? Is do we have a misperception about how much of this is being driven by compliance programs, either legal regulatory frameworks or internal versus not? A thought I had from one of your comments earlier too was something that we've heard a lot is our enterprise customers want to be able to hook in their external services to GitLab. So they have a bunch of action or activity that's happening outside of our environment, but they still want to see that in one place. And so, one path we can explore if we aren't already to some degree is in the context of compliance, how do we enable them to send us the data they want us to aggregate for them and then make sure that that's correlated appropriately with various activities, right? So if I create a merge request, I want to see that external services A, B, and C all executed properly. The company knows what those systems are checking for. I see some visual indicator within GitLab, and then when I approve and merge that merge request, I then have an artifact that's generated that says, yes, here's all the stuff in GitLab, but also here's the unique hashes associated with these external processes. So things like that, where maybe it's something where our position could be, we're going to give you the flexibility to customize this environment the way you need to be compliant and to have that comfort and reassurance because your needs are highly nuanced as an organization operating in this regulated industry. Even versus your neighbor company who's in the same industry. And then our focus is then on like the reporting and the analysis and the informative posture of, hey, you've connected all these services. We noticed that things are off in some way. We've been able to sort of extrapolate from our learnings, and then we can give them actionable insight based off of that. But that's all still something that we're trying to figure out as well.
That's helpful to hear though. Because one thing that I would like to see release turn into is a helpful model of like, how do we help other releases become more successful in GitLab? And part of that is attaching more to that release object and having the ability to upload files and to connect. This policy was a part of this release, or this Docker image, or this package, or these files. Like, we currently don't allow us to upload information into a release, but being able to support that functionality goes to exactly what you're saying, which is creating that information repository in one place and aggregating it in a meaningful way. Even if we just upload it and attach it, it gives them that single thread throughout their production history. But it does make it challenging because people want that just from a, hey, I want to manage all my artifacts in a single location. And that goes into like Tim Rizzi's part, how do we effectively support that scale? But then when we're looking at the compliance side of it, we need to make sure that our permissions are right, or that we're not, showing secrets in a certain way, or that we're able to prevent nefarious actors from, accessing audit events that were read only. And it gets a little bit more out of my lane of like, how do I architect requirements to ensure that we're not opening it up to cause problems in an audit? Because the more things that we include in the release object, the more risk we inherently add to releases. We found that out with like release evidence, for example, that we wanted the JSON file to contain all of the related issues and milestones, but unintentionally we exposed a bunch of information that wasn't expected.
And can we unpack that just a little bit? I mean, I saw the issue about should we include open issues? Is that what you're referring to, or were there other concerns?
Yeah, so open issues being one of them, but also that whole hash structure that we currently have, which doesn't have any merge request associated with it, but also including all of the issues within any given release meant that you are exposing confidential issues to people in that project that may not have access to confidential issues.
Yeah, so not the purpose of this call, but just some feedback, which is maybe helpful. So I think what you could do is you could say, because, hey, let me back up a little bit. So I think that the report in and of itself is super valuable, right? I think we should provide for every release, here's the list of merge requests. Ideally, the merge request would require at least one linked issue if it doesn't already. I don't think it does. But that issue is the justification, right? The business case for the change to be made. So you have the merge request, which has the linked issue. It should ideally also link the pipelines and jobs associated with that merge request, show the pass fail set, like it should have all of this data. But as far as the issues that are confidential, I mean, is there a way that you could hash the issue itself? Like if confidential, take a hash of this, because in theory that identifier for the issue won't change on the back end anyway. So the auditor could say, okay, show me the hash of that issue from production, and you can compare them that way.
It's interesting. We evaded that completely and actually said that you have to have the auditor role in order to see release evidence. So we just elevated who gets to see release evidence. That way, the IDs of confidential issues can still be contained within the release hash. But the issues are no longer contained in the JSON file. So we avoid the risk of leaking the content of a confidential issue. So the auditor role can now click the link of the ID to the issue that's confidential or not in that JSON file. And the next part, though, is adding in the merge requests, which are more meaningful about the actions that were committed in production. There's another nuance that I need to understand a little bit more, is the ability to link to a deployment, as this isn't something that we necessarily support inside of GitLab today. We're able to indicate that this is a release, which is a package, a collection of issues, but it doesn't necessarily tie back to an environment we're in production. Right. So this is where pulling together that full story, that this package is now floating in production without distilling that from clicking into an issue summary, just to get fleshed out.
Yeah, so I'm also curious to understand. So I don't know how long is this scheduled for? We have another 8 or something. Okay, just want to make sure I'm not keeping you.
No, I scheduled it for 40 minutes because I wanted us to like flesh out things that make sense for us to work together.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you for that. So I'd be curious to understand too, right? Like we have the auditor role, but that sounds like it's catered towards auditing or compliance teams internal to a customer's organization, right? For the most part, as you understand it.
Exactly.
So is there concern with including those confidential issues in an exportable artifact that's then handed off to a third-party auditor?
I think that it's all read only.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was exported, it would be just a snapshot in time. So from our users' requirements of being able to show at that moment in time when that release was created with all of these related issues, what was contained in that release,
Mm-hmm.
that is to do with what they see fit.
Yeah.
I agree, though, that it does expose risk of leak of information if that third party person now has the credentials to click into that link and then see that confidential issue as a read only.
Yeah, and every organization will be different in their tolerance for that. Third-party auditors are generally sort of these, liaisons that are kind of given carte blanche access to stuff. And I'm sure this is not this is a very broad stroke, but if you have a third-party auditor come in and they say, I'd like to see, to my example earlier, I'd like to see the last 6 months of merge requests. If that includes confidential issues, they'll want to see that, right? Because then in theory, you have merge requests that show up with nothing if you were to omit them, and then the auditor is going to want to drill in, which is not necessarily a problem, right? You could have a placeholder that says confidential issue, and then the auditor could go in via the auditor role to look at that. So there are workarounds there, but it's a consideration to think about, because our auditor role is great for real-time. SOC 2 Type 1, for example, is exactly a snapshot of time type of certification. And so evidence artifacts being a snapshot in time are exactly what auditors are looking for, though they'll jump around the timeline, right? Show me last week, show me a year ago, show me, this random date range. That's something we can certainly dig into more, I think. I was just kind of curious about it.
No, I think that that's very relevant because right now in 12.8, I have this issue to create another snapshot in time. So we have the first snapshot, which is at release creation. And that just shows when you've said, I want to create this release, this is the status of the issues in that release and all the stuff that's in it, which might mean that we want to contain open issues if that's at the release creation. But then when the release is completed or deployed or in production, that would be the second snapshot. And that would be the status of all the closed issues, confidential or not, at that time that we've declared it deployed. And by we've, the customer has declared it as deployed. But I would agree that there might be something worth investigating on how do we also support like a slowly changing fact story for releases if auditors are going to want to see that over time.
Yeah, and I think so. My assumption right now, and based on the calls I've had, enterprises or just customers in general want the ability to export these evidence artifacts so that they have it historically, so that they can go in and provide it as needed, either internally or externally for audits. Right. The nice thing about what it sounds like you're working on, as I understand it currently, is I've had several enterprise customers say, I want to download artifacts that show me the merge requests, the associated issues, and the associated pipelines. So that in and of itself it would be a big win, or is a big win, because I'm not sure what exists currently, but for some of our compliance-minded customers who are focused on that.
And I will, I'll ping you on this issue. Let me figure out what your handle is. What's your handle?
It's just full Matt Gonzalez.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, funny. So this is the second half of the first implementation of release evidence. Mm-hmm. And this one is creating that second snapshot in time. But it would be interesting to get your thought of how important it is from the customers you've been speaking to about compliance needs to include additional information inside this JSON field. If I can type.
Always happens to me. My worst accuracy is whenever I'm on a call.
I, I don't know why it does that. It's like for some reason that stage fright. I'm not sure. Okay. So I think we have about 2 minutes left. Some action items that I'll take forward are sort of the future storyboarding of release governance concepts that I want to just kind of run through with you and to make sure that they're salient from a compliance vision, or if I'm missing some key components, more specifically around the granularity of permissioning, because that seems to be a big concern in general for a lot of our enterprise users. So I would like to hear that perspective. Other than that, if you need help collaborating on any MRs about how to inject compliance mindset into how our PMs are working today, I would love to partner with you on that. So just let me know.
Yeah, so I know that Access has policies, MVC, that should help to address a lot of the granularity permissions concerns. The invitation about introducing compliance thinking into the merge request. So the merge request experience, does that fall under your purview, or?
It's like split between Ori and progressive delivery and myself, and then probably even like infrastructure upstream of that.
Yeah, okay. So that makes sense, because I have a call, and I'll probably add you to it on Tuesday, if I can find my calendar, to talk with, looks like Yorick, because I think he's on our delivery team, internal delivery team. And so they've apparently built out this really cool merge request widget that allows them to hook in their external services they use to deploy two or four GitLab. And so I wanted to schedule time with him to talk about, okay, how do I then take that and make it available for customers? That's exactly what they want, but it's within the merge request widget. So it sounds like something that you'd probably be keen on.
Definitely interesting for me, at least from a deployment continuity experience too. So that's perfect. I'll go ahead and stop our recording.